Some souls arrive on soft winds, light, effortless, wrapped in the lullaby of love. Their names are spoken with gentleness. Their cries are answered without hesitation. But not every soul enters this world cradled in warmth. Some of us were born into fire. Not the fire that warms, but the one that burns quietly behind closed doors. We came into rooms that smelled of silence, into homes where love was not spoken but measured. Measured in obedience, in performance, in the absence of need. And still we waited, longing for a moment of being seen. If you've ever felt like a visitor in your own childhood, if you sat at a dinner table that echoed with unspoken grief, if you've ever whispered, "Why me? Why this?" You are not broken. You were chosen. Carl Jung believed the soul does not arrive by accident. It chooses, consciously, wisely, not the path of comfort, but the path of transformation. Souls like the ones who shimmer with a different rhythm, are not random anomalies in the family line. They are seeds of change planted in hardened soil. You didn't come here to be loved the old way. You came to remember what love truly is. The black sheep, the dreamers, the sensitive ones, the cycle breakers, we don't arrive to fit in. We arrive to feel, to disrupt, to wake the sleeping patterns with our pain, our questions, our refusal to pretend. This is not your punishment. This is your sacred passage. And as we journey inward, let us uncover why your soul may have chosen this family, this fracture, this fire, not to wound you, but to wake you, to begin your return, not to where you came from, but to who you've always been. Not all inheritances are visible. Some are passed down like shadows, unspoken, unnamed, heavy. You did not receive heirlooms. You received silence. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful, but watchful. The kind that swallows whole the things no one dares to say. In some families, pain isn't screamed. It's folded into glances, into sighs, into long pauses that never quite resolve. Love becomes a transaction. Worth becomes a role. And the soul becomes a shapeshifter. You may have learned young that to be safe, you must shrink. To be loved, you must disappear. Carl Jung wrote of the family complex, a psychic inheritance composed not of stories, but of silent contracts. You will not feel, you will not question, you will carry what we cannot. But sometimes a soul enters that will not forget itself. A soul that arrives with ancient memory. A memory not of trauma, but of truth. And it disrupts everything. You were that soul. You came into a room thick with pretense and chose to feel anyway. You looked around and could not understand why the smiles didn't reach the eyes, why no one spoke of the ache everyone carried. You thought, there must be something wrong with me. But the truth is, there was something right with you. Something untouched, unconditioned, something alive. And that life made others uncomfortable. Because when you refuse to play a role, you force others to see the mask they wear. You became the mirror they weren't ready for. The one who said, "This ends with me." Not out of rebellion, but out of remembrance. Remembrance of a deeper kind of love. A love that doesn't require performance. A love that doesn't punish truth. A love that sets fire to the lie, not to destroy the home, but to rebuild it. And so your path began, not on a road paved with welcome, but through a forest thick with forgetting. But the one who walks alone learns to hear the soul again. In homes where love is quiet and pain is quieter, children become translators, not of language but of tension, of the sudden stillness when a door opens, of the shift in temperature when truth walks into a room. You were one of those children. You noticed everything. The silence after certain questions, the way joy felt borrowed, like something on loan, the smiles that hovered too long, the invisible threads of control pulled tight beneath the dinner table. Even then, your body knew what your mind hadn't yet learned to name. This wasn't safety. This was survival. Carl Jung believed that some souls are born seers, not with their eyes, but with their presence, not to accuse, but to awaken. And in families built on denial, awakening is dangerous. Because when one person sees what others pretend not to, the whole house begins to shake. You may have been called too sensitive, too suspicious, too dramatic, too much, but none of those names were yours. You weren't too much. You were honest, you were lucid, and you were terrifying. Not because you harmed anyone, but because your presence cracked the illusion. In family systems held together by silence, truth becomes the threat, and the one who speaks it becomes the exile. But exile is not always a punishment. Sometimes it's the beginning of freedom. Jung would say you were not meant to fix the family. You were meant to walk through it, like a dreamer through a forest, gathering the hidden parts of yourself that were never allowed to exist under their roof. You weren't born to repeat the script. You were born to walk off the stage. And though it hurts, this not belonging, this endless ache for connection, you must understand, you didn't lose the family. You outgrew the illusion. That ache you feel is not emptiness. It is your soul reclaiming space, and that is sacred. There comes a moment in every soul's journey when the ache becomes too loud to ignore. It begins quietly, a subtle trembling inside moments that should feel safe, a strange emptiness even when surrounded by people who say they love you, a quiet voice whispering, "This isn't it." And perhaps for a time, you tried to silence it. You played the role. You smiled when your heart wanted to scream. You folded your truth into corners, tucked beneath performance, until even you began to forget where you'd hidden yourself. But the soul never forgets. Carl Jung called this rupture the sacred wound, not because the pain is holy, but because within the pain, the self begins to rise. It doesn't rise like a warrior, not at first. It rises like mist through the cracks in your pretending. That moment you broke down in your car, alone and unnoticed, that was the soul. That night you whispered to no one, "I can't live like this anymore." That was the soul. The sacred wound is not the wound itself. It is what it awakens. And it often begins in families that do not know how to see you, how to hold you, how to love you without asking you to disappear. But you felt too much to stay numb. You sensed too deeply to be silent. And though it left you isolated, it also made you whole. Sensitivity is not a flaw. It is the nervous system of the soul. And when pain touches it, you don't just suffer, you awaken. You awaken to nuance, to energy, to truth wrapped in shadows. You begin to notice what others fear feeling. And in that noticing, you become a different kind of healer. Not by fixing others, but by reclaiming the self you abandoned to survive. This is not about blame. This is about becoming. Becoming someone who no longer betrays themselves to belong. Becoming someone who listens to the wound and asks, "What are you trying to show me?" You don't need to close the wound to be whole. You need to honor it. Sit beside it. Let it speak. Because what breaks you open is also what lets the light come in. Some kinds of love come with strings, invisible, but tight. You don't see them at first. You only feel the pull. Be good, be quiet, be useful, be less. In some families, love is not given, it's traded. A currency exchanged for obedience, performance, perfection. And you learned the cost early. You learned that affection might follow achievement, but not presence. You learned that approval might follow agreement, but not truth. And so piece by piece, you made yourself smaller. You smiled when something inside you broke. You laughed on cue. You became the version of yourself that disturbed no one. And they called it love, but it wasn't. It was control, dressed up in familiarity. Carl Jung wrote that the soul cannot grow where the false self is worshipped. And in many families, authenticity is exiled. You began to realize something wasn't right, but you couldn't name it. You only knew you felt tired, tired in your bones, tired of earning what should be given freely, tired of guessing which version of you would be safe that day. But the soul doesn't come here to be tolerated. It comes to be remembered. And so the ache grew, not to punish you, but to lead you home. You were not meant to live on scraps of love. You were meant to remember that love, real love, does not flinch at your truth. You were not too emotional. You were honest. You were not too intense. You were alive. And that aliveness, that unbearable, beautiful aliveness, was never a flaw. It was your frequency, the very vibration your lineage needed, but didn't know how to hold. You were not chosen because you were broken. You were chosen because you remembered. And every time you honored what they asked you to suppress, every time you spoke what others buried, every time you said no more to what others called normal, you weren't just healing yourself. You were remembering love. Not the kind that silences, the kind that sees, the kind that says, "You don't need to earn me. I was yours all along." There's a kind of loneliness that isn't about being alone. It's about standing in a room full of people who speak your language but not your truth. It's the ache of being surrounded, yet unseen. It's the fatigue of always adjusting your volume, your tone, your light, just to make others comfortable. If you've ever walked through your childhood home feeling like a ghost in your own body, you know this loneliness. Carl Jung wrote that the path of individuation often begins in exile, but not all exiles are sent away. Some are simply never invited in. You weren't rejected because you were wrong. You were left out because you were real. And in families where truth is feared, authenticity is treated like betrayal. So the one who sees becomes the problem. The one who feels becomes the threat. The one who questions becomes the stranger. You became the stranger, not to the world, but to your own blood. But hear this, you are not lost. You are forging a path that has never been walked before. Isolation is not a punishment, it is preparation. The black sheep is not broken. The black sheep is the blueprint. The one who refuses to repeat. The one who says, I don't know where I'm going, but I know I'm not staying here. That voice inside you, the one that kept whispering, this isn't who I am. This isn't what love is. There must be more than this. That was the map. Not away from them, but back to you. And the solitude you now carry, it is sacred ground, the soil in which your self begins to root. Because before you can belong to anyone else, you must belong to yourself. So if the table you were born into had no seat for your soul, then you are here to build a new table. Not just for you, but for all the ones to come. There's a silence that feels like safety, and there's a silence that chokes. In many families, truth is the one thing never invited to dinner. It hovers in the doorway, unspoken, unwanted, known. You may have been the one who broke that silence, the one who asked the forbidden questions, the one who said aloud what everyone had been tiptoeing around for years. You weren't trying to destroy anything. You were just trying to breathe. But in homes built on denial, truth is treated like fire. And you became the match. Carl Jung taught that the soul must pass through shadow to become whole. But what he also knew, what many forget, is that sometimes the shadow is not just within us, it is around us, woven into generations of pretending. You saw it, you named it, you refused to carry it forward, and they called you the problem. But listen gently now. You weren't breaking the family, you were breaking the spell. You were not the destroyer, you were the revealer. And yes, truth can make people uncomfortable, but only because they've made a home out of what hurts. When you shattered the illusion, you didn't just free yourself. You created a crack in the story, a crack wide enough for the light to begin slipping in. You may have been met with rage, or silence, or that chilling smile that says, we don't talk about those things here. But that's okay. You weren't meant to be understood. You were meant to be real. And being real is a revolutionary act in a family that survives on masks. So if they said you betrayed them, know this. You only betrayed the lie. And that is not betrayal. That is sacred loyalty. To the truth, to yourself, to all those who came before and never had the courage to speak. You are not the fire that burned the house. You are the breath that finally said, this air isn't clean. And now the air is moving. The silence is trembling. The lineage is shifting. There are some aches that don't begin with us. They arrive like echoes, ancient, aching, already halfway through the body before we even understand they're not ours. You've likely felt it. That deep, hollow sadness that has no clear origin. That sudden wave of grief while folding laundry, or standing at a window, or holding someone who cannot hold you back. Carl Jung believed that what is not made conscious returns as fate, and in families that fate becomes inheritance. Not just eye color or posture, but shame, silence, the fear of being seen, the guilt of existing too loudly. But what if your sensitivity isn't just yours? What if your tenderness is the echo of a grandmother who never got to cry? A great uncle who swallowed love until it turned to stone in his chest? A mother who wanted to run but stayed and forgot her own name? You are not just one life. You are the trembling thread in a web that stretches back centuries. And your pain, your exquisite, unbearable pain, isn't random. It's a signal, a flare, a place in the lineage saying, here. Here is where the healing must begin. Not by blaming, not by hating, but by becoming. By holding what was denied, by feeling what was numbed, by saying what was silenced. You are the living answer to the unanswered questions of your ancestors. You are the first inhale after generations of holding their breath. They couldn't do it. But you can, not because you're stronger, but because your soul arrived with memory. And memory, true soul memory, remembers not just the wound, but the way home. So when it hurts, don't just ask, why me? Ask, what stops with me? Ask, what begins with me? You were not chosen to suffer. You were chosen to awaken. Not just for yourself, but for all those who could not. There is a moment on the path when you stop running from your past and begin walking toward yourself. Not with rage, not with blame, but with an aching kind of love, the kind that burns away illusion and softens everything it touches. You no longer need them to say sorry. You no longer wait for understanding that may never arrive, because something deeper has awakened, a truth that no longer negotiates its place. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But he also knew, to become the self, you must walk through the fire of forgetting, through the wreckage of old roles, through the echo of everyone you tried to be. And that is what you've done. You left the stage. You shed the costume. You stood naked in the ruins of your false inheritance. And in that silence, you heard the voice of your soul, not demanding, not loud, but steady and unmistakably yours. You are not what they called you, not the scapegoat, not the rebel, not the fragile one, not the problem. You are the remembering, the rerouting, the reckoning wrapped in love. You are the child who felt too much because your soul was built to feel what they buried. You are the breath that said, I won't carry this forward. And that doesn't make you disloyal. It makes you the living bridge between what was and what could be. You no longer need to fix them. You no longer need to fit in. You no longer need to explain why you walked away. You walked away not to escape, but to return, to truth, to depth, to self. And in doing so, you did not leave them behind. You lifted them silently, invisibly into a new possibility. This is resurrection. This is how the lineage begins again. Not every journey ends with a door. Some end with a window, cracked just enough to let the light in. You've walked far, not in miles, but in memory, across the silent terrain of your childhood, through the fog of forgetting, into the storm of becoming. And now you arrive, not at a finish line, but at a truth so quiet, so steady, it no longer needs to be proven. You were never broken. You were breaking through. The family you were born into was not a mistake. It was a mirror, a furnace, a sacred initiation. Not into pain, but into presence. Not into suffering, but into seeing. Carl Jung believed that the soul chooses its path with precision. And if you were born into fire, into silence, into ache, it was not to be consumed, but to become the flame that gives warmth to those still shivering in stories not their own. So now, take a breath. Place your hand over your chest. Feel the soft thump of the soul that survived. Whisper these words, not to the world, but to yourself. I was not born into pain to be punished. I was born into shadow to remember the light. I was not meant to belong. I was meant to awaken, and I have begun. Let the silence wrap around you now, not the silence of suppression, but of peace. You have done the sacred work. You have become what they could not imagine. And even if they never understand, your soul does. It always has. Now rest, you are home. Summon another.